goodness, terrible. Really kind of a boring camera angle, but we're working on fixing that. Good afternoon. It's Sunday, the 25th, and this is Geoff Parrish, and I'm doing the weekly review of the news, Geov Seattle Politics. Thank you for joining me. Want to go back and look at the final results, or the almost final results of the primary election. There was one race that was really too close to call when we last talked. That was the Public Lands Commissioner race statewide. The management of the state's lands, including its forests, and of course, conservation is a huge issue in that, as is wildfire management. And the winner of that race was really not very close, as Pete Serrano, the former mayor of Pasco, a Republican. But it's a top two primary, meaning that the top two finishers go to the general election in November. And the second place in that race is very, very tight. Dave Up the Grove, King County Council member, great guy, running on a conservation platform, running on a platform concerned about climate change and wildfire management and all those good things. He won by exactly 51 votes. So there will need to be a hand recount in the statewide race, which is insane. So there will need to be a hand recount of that going into excuse me, here, there we go. Going into September, and probably Up the Grove will come out on top of that. The hand recounts usually don't have significant changes, but 51 votes is very, very tight. And the third place finisher, at least for the time being, is Sue Peterson, another Republican. So if she manages to catch Up the Grove, it will be the first time in a while there's been a statewide Republican office holder, because the top two finishers in the primary are both Republicans. If Up the Grove manages to hang on, there's a fourth place finisher that got a significant number of votes. So Up the Grove is probably going to be the favorite going into November, if only because in the general election, in the November race, there are a lot more voters, especially in a presidential year, and those voters tend to be more liberal or more progressive than the voters in the primary. They tend to skew younger. They tend to skew more progressive. They tend to come more heavily from Western Washington, which, of course, tends to be more liberal than the eastern half of the state. So that will bear watching. The results of that hand recount won't be available until after Labor Day. So it's a very short window for people running for the November election, when ballots for that will be mailed by mid-October. So it's coming right up. And speaking of the election, let's move to national politics. And the big news this past week, of course, was the Democratic National Committee convention in Chicago. A lot of interesting moments in that, of course, as is common for the conventions. There's not a lot of actual news. The running mate has already been selected. It's just a 4-day infomercial for the party. That said, and given that the Democrats had a very short window to plan a convention that celebrated Kamala Harris as opposed to Joe Biden, who was originally supposed to be the person being celebrated, they did a great job, and they pulled in a number of celebrities. It was great to see Stevie Wonder performing. Oprah made an appearance. And, of course, all the party stars, the Obamas, had exceptional speeches, particularly Michelle. I thought hers was probably the strongest speech of the week. And, yes, I watched them all, God help me. Um, but there were a number of very good presentations. Uh, Michelle had the line of the week asking who's going to tell Donald Trump that the job he's seeking might be one of those black jobs. I love it. Shade. And, a lot of people pointing out the problems with Donald Trump, of which there are many to choose from, um, and really soft pedaling what Biden's main attack line was, which is that he's a threat to democracy. You didn't hear as much of that this past week. What you heard was that he did not have the temperament to be president, given his felony convictions, his civil case conviction for defamation of E. Jean Carroll, and which was based on his having committed sexual assault against her. And a lot of talk about women's reproductive health and women's rights. You had testimonials from several women who went through harrowing experiences and red AIDS because their pregnancies ended badly. And, Kamala Harris's campaign has been a remarkable groundswell of grassroots support. So far, uh, uh, 1.5 million new donors, which is just amazing. That has never happened before. And there were also protests by pro-Palestinian groups. Marches every day. There was a number of arrests Tuesday evening, including 3 journalists who were trying to cover the marches. The main networks, of course, didn't really mention any of the protests, and really the one unfortunate aspect of the entire week was you didn't have you had almost all of the Democrats' constituent groups represented up there on stage at one point or another, except you did not have any Palestinian Americans. You had parents of an American being held hostage by Hamas, but you did not have anyone sharing what's been going on in Gaza and, for that matter, the West Bank, but particularly Gaza over the last, for the last 9 months, 10 months, that Israel has been, killing civilians, bombing civilian infrastructure. There was another major airstrike on Gaza this week that killed a number of Palestinians. Almost no mention in American media, and certainly no mention from the DNC stage, which was unfortunate. Kamala Harris's speech on Thursday night did mention in passing, it's a shame about those Palestinians when she was talking about the Middle East. But she's not as stridently pro-Israel as Biden is, and maybe that's positive. If she happens to win in November and takes office in January, maybe that will help bring peace to the Middle East. Who knows? Biden, of course, has been trying to get a ceasefire in place, and he announced this week that there were that Israel had agreed in principle to the American ceasefire plan. Now, the details of that plan have not been leaked. I'm sort of sliding into the Middle East here. The details of that plan have not been leaked, so we don't know exactly how pro-Israel that is. The United States is not exactly a neutral arbiter of peace between Palestinians and Israelis, but there's really nobody else in a position to negotiate this because Israel won't talk with anyone else. They won't talk with Europe, the European Union, or other Western powers. They're certainly not going to talk to, say, Russia as a neutral arbiter of a peace plan. So really, it's only the United States that's in a position to do it. And of course, yesterday you had an exchange of missile fire, relatively frightening for the possibility of escalation. But so far, it has not escalated between Hezbollah and Israel. Hezbollah is a political party in southern Lebanon that is heavily supported by Iran. Um, and they had vowed revenge and had already had a very limited missile strike on northern Israel, about 30 missiles a couple of weeks ago. This time it was between 150 and 200 missiles that were aimed toward Israel. No reports of any damage. Israel managed to intercept most of those, and probably the United States helped as well. Um, and at the same time, Israel struck. The firing began with Israel saying that we are launching a preemptive strike on Hezbollah targets that are preparing to uh, attack Israeli targets. So they're spinning this as self defense. It's self defense to strike first is the logic, which um, the potential for that to escalate is very real, especially and bear in mind that Hezbollah has vowed revenge because Israel assassinated its top military leader in July. Now we're waiting also for Iran's retaliatory strike for Israel having targeted a Hamas uh, official in a guest house in Tehran, the capital of Iran, in late July. Um, which is kind of audacious that Israel sent a missile into the capital of Iran. So Iran's a little upset about that and has vowed revenge on its own timeline. There was concern that it would happen around the 12th or 13th. It did not. So Israel's still waiting for that as well. And that, again, has the potential, even more so than an exchange with Hezbollah, it has the potential to really escalate into a wider regional war and also torpedo Biden's efforts at any kind of ceasefire. Now, the problem with this is that Netanyahu domestically is on very thin ice. He his ruling coalition includes a number of, frankly, open fascists who want to eliminate the Palestinian people. And yes, that's as fascist as it sounds, honestly, and as racist. But he has no, in terms of his domestic politics in Israel, he has no incentive to agree to a ceasefire because these hardliners really want to just bomb the hell out of Palestinians until they're gone. Um, and, Palestinian refugees are being moved from camp to camp while the IDF claims that, oops, we're going to bomb in this area now, so you have to move over there to be safe. And they're saying, well, where do we go? There's nowhere we can go at this point. Israel has also, and this has not been widely reported in Western media, but the Israeli military has pushed 3 miles into Egypt, beyond the border between Gaza and Egypt, which is a very thin, about 10-mile stretch where have been a lot of tunnels dug in order to get supplies into Gaza and to evade the blockade that Israel imposes to basically, they don't want to starve Palestinians to death. They don't want to deny them all medical care, but they want to deny them most medical care. And they want to make sure that, Palestinians are at best malnourished and have to scramble in order to get basic food. This has been going on for years. And the world basically passes resolutions condemning the human rights abuses, blah, 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 and otherwise does nothing. So one wonders how long this can go on. And this is one of the things that people were protesting in Chicago. Let's see. So before we wander on to other global issues, let's talk a little bit about other national issues. There was also a primary this past week in Alaska. And The Democrat, Petrola, who's an incumbent, won with about 51% of the vote. So she is in very good position to uh, be returned to Congress. She is the first Native Alaskan ever served in Congress, and her appeal is quite broad. She managed to uh, get elected in 2022 over a MAGA Republican who just scared the hell out of too many Alaskans. So they managed to uh, elect the Democrat when that seat had been held by Republicans since before statehood, particularly by Don Young, who was there forever. He of the famous "the internet is a series of tubes" comment. Um, so, um, yeah, most of the news this past week was political. Um, the There was also um, uh, in terms of international news, Canada was in the news for a couple of reasons. There was a national rail strike, which would have badly affected both the Canadian economy in particular, but also the U.S. economy. Canada is a geographically huge country that is very dependent on rail to get manufactured goods across the country, to get grain across the country from the prairies where it's farmed and processed. And the Canadian government on Thursday immediately declared declared the strike over and sent it to mediation. Because they declared it a national emergency. Whatever that's happened in the U.S. in the past with similar kind of labor strikes. Um, so. The other thing that happened in Canada this past week is a number of synagogues and Jewish organizations and institutions received identical emails containing death threats and threats of violence over the Middle East conflict. But it's not cool. That is anti-Semitic because you're targeting people because they are Jewish, not because they are specifically supporting Israel or Israeli government policy vis-a-vis the military occupation of Palestinian lands or the settler occupation or anything else that Israel is doing that's beyond the pale. That conflict, if it blows up, and it very well could, because right now Iran is involved, Lebanon is involved. The Lebanese government so far has been relatively silent about yesterday's attacks, but they're weak vis-a-vis Israel. Israel is one of the strongest militaries in the world, and that's not even counting the military support Biden is giving them that is specifically earmarked for the war in Gaza and attacks on Palestinian civilians. It's very hard to get an accurate death toll of how many people have died over the past 10 months in Gaza, but it is in five figures. Clearly, the 20,000, 30,000. Estimates vary, but it's truly a human rights atrocity. And if they can get a ceasefire going, great. But it's not looking very good right now. Um, so let's see what else went on. It was as these often happen. Oh, I know what I meant to mention. One of the things that was not happening in Chicago, Governor Greg Abbott of Texas had been sending busloads of quote unquote illegal immigrants to democratically run cities: Washington, D.C., Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, etc., for a number of months. 120,000 of those migrants had been sent to democratically run cities. And, part of it is just owning the libs. Part of it is to force those cities to have to give social services to the migrants. Drain resources from and create resentment of the migrants, because they often wind up in shelters because they never signed up to go to New York or LA or Chicago. So these huge cities where they don't have any contacts, they don't have any way of establishing themselves. It's really very cruel. And of course, as is often the case with MAGA Republicans, the cruelty is the point. But those busloads of migrants, which Abbott had threatened to send to Chicago just ahead of the Democratic convention, they never showed up. And in fact, there haven't been any busloads of migrants coming from Texas for the past couple of months. It turns out that when Biden changed the asylum policy in early to mid June, the number of asylum seekers crossing the border legally dropped precipitously because U.S. policy then became to keep them in Mexico while their asylum requests are processed, as opposed to the United States. So they haven't had enough migrants to fill busloads. There just aren't any. So yeah, so they did not show up in Chicago this past week, and they haven't shown up in Chicago or New York, LA, or DC, or any of these other cities for a couple of months now. Yeah, the cruelty is the point, but by Biden's change in policy, which made it much more difficult for migrants who are trying to enter the U.S. legally, it worked in terms of stemming the tide of people crossing the border into the United States. Now, the Republican, one of the lines of attack on Kamala Harris that hasn't stuck very well so far is on immigration, because early on, Biden tasked her early in his presidency with trying to address the root causes of all the migration north from particularly Central American countries where drug cartels are rampant violence, authoritarian governments persecuting, indigenous minorities, persecuting dissidents, which there's a lot of overlap with that. She was supposed to address that, and she certainly met with a number of the leaders from that region and tried to address it. But it's those causes are persistent. Central America is in the middle of a major drought right now because of climate change. And that is causing people who make their living from the land, indigenous farmers, etc., to not be able to feed themselves. They don't have any choice but to migrate to major cities in the region, Guatemala City, Mexico City, Guadalajara, etc. And many of them try to make their way further north, and particularly if they have a viable case for seeking political asylum, try to enter the United States legally. That process has just gotten that much more difficult. And, really the original impulse in the Biden administration to try and address the root causes in Central America is the right idea, but it's very difficult to do. You'd have to pour a lot of money into the region. You'd have to, make sure that the authoritarian governments of countries like El Salvador and Guatemala are accountable to their constituents. And, democracy isn't necessarily the answer, because elections can be rigged, as we well know, because the United States has been in that business for decades. But trying to at least make it so that people in those countries can make a living, because right now they can't, which is really unfortunate. Immigration is going to be a huge issue and a huge point of attack for Republicans. And I think, both Obama and Clinton had very valuable reminders for, giddy Democrats who were talking about joy and dancing in the aisles and so forth at the convention this week, that it's going to be a dogfight. It's going to be a very close election, and Republicans are going to do everything in their power to tilt the scales. in terms of voter suppression, in terms of who counts the ballots, and in terms of just ignoring the results if there's a result they don't like, and saying that it was a fixed election and fraudulent and all the rest of that. And my fear is there's a near certainty that if Donald Trump loses, he's not going to concede. And there is a near certainty that at least his followers, if not Trump himself, will call for violence. Now, I don't think that will take the same form as it did last January 6, 2021. For one thing, security will be a lot better because it won't be Donald Trump in charge of Capitol security. And we still haven't gotten a good answer in January 6th in terms of why there were so few Capitol Police on hand and why that agency was essentially ordered to stand down. Who issued that order? Where did it come from? How did it happen? Because we have still never heard the answer to that question. Yeah, and why it took so long to mobilize appropriate law enforcement once the Capitol was stormed. And even 3 years after the fact, 3.5 years after the fact, I still can't believe I'm uttering that sentence. But I vividly remember where I was the day that happened, and probably many of you do too. I was not at the Capitol, I'll tell you that. So anyway, let's see if anything else interesting happened this week. The thing about late August is there's very little usually going on. Oh, I know what I wanted to mention. This week, the regulators approved the new COVID vaccine that'll be coming out next month sometime. We don't have an exact date yet. We had false reports earlier this month that it was available, but that turned out not to be the case. The other thing the Biden administration is doing is it's going to make free COVID test kits available again, up to 4 per household, and that will be happening again later next month sometime. We don't have the logistics on that again, but I will pass that on as soon as I know. COVID numbers are up in some parts of the country. They're up sharply, and that's usually something of a surprise for summer. Usually there's kind of a lull in summer, but the particular variant of COVID that's out now, it's not more virulent. People are not getting sicker. They're not getting hospitalized, but a lot of people are getting COVID. It's very easy to transmit. The symptoms are relatively mild, but people who are older, people who have underlying health conditions, COVID can still be very, very serious. So, if you're in indoor spaces, wear masks. And as we get into the unseasonably cool weather in the Seattle area for the past week, and apparently next week as well, it's like we're already in fall. So, once it starts raining, people are going to start being indoors, and indoor spaces are the conduit for an airborne disease. So wear a mask and practice social distancing. You know the drill because we've been doing it for 4 years now, and it's still very, very dangerous. And with that, I'm going to sign off. Thank you again for joining me, and we'll be back next week. My goal is to be doing this every weekend and trying to get a regular time set up, but life keeps interfering, so we'll just keep doing this as we can. But it'll probably be next weekend sometime in the holiday weekend. Have a good rest of your August, and thank you very much for watching.